Hello, my friends. We are going to be talking about immigration policy. I'm going to give you a timeline of what those policies have looked like or not looked like in the United States, and then kind of what it all means and where we go from here. So we first started talking about immigration back in 1790 with the Naturalization Act. It was a law that only granted citizenship to free white persons of what they called good moral character. So good moral character at the time meant that you engaged in what they called pious ways of living. You didn't drink, you didn't smoke, you didn't engage in gambling, any of those sinful things. So if you did any of those, it was much harder to gain citizenship. Then they changed the residency requirements in 1795 to make it such that you had to have lived here for at least 3 years. And then in 1798, so you had to have lived here for at least 5 years in order to become a citizen and, acted in that good moral way. Then in 1802, they passed the Naturalization Law, which only repealed the Naturalization Act. Then prior to the Civil War, the land was empty except for those, pesky indigenous folks that we didn't really care about. So we just wanted to settle all the empty land. We opened up the frontier, and we just basically declared all the land out there that was not settled in the way we considered land to be settled was free game. And part of the reason the land was semi-empty is because the genocide that the settlers had committed and the displacement of the indigenous people had rendered those lands empty and unused. Then came the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And during that time, when there was a lot of focus on states' rights, a number of states passed their own immigration laws and limits. In 1868, we passed the 14th Amendment, which protected any children born in the United States. That's the law from which we get the kind of gross term of anchor babies, because it basically stated that if you were born in the U.S., even if neither of your parents had citizenship, you yourself were a citizen, and they generally did not, at the time, separate those children from their parents. 1870, they decided that black people could be naturalized, if not citizens. 1875, the Supreme Court then declared that immigration, any laws related to immigration, were only things that the federal government could monitor. So it took away that the state's rights to pass their own immigration laws and made it a federal power. 1880, we saw a massive influx of immigrants. For the most part, it was agricultural, but it was also industry. We needed immigrants and people who would work for low wages to build factories and work in those factories. But additionally, we needed those immigrants to build the exact railroad lines that we use to this day. Then in 1882, now a lot of those immigrants that came over, particularly to California, were from Asia, specifically from China. In 1882, we passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was the first immigration law in terms of restricting immigration that was ever passed by Congress. So you notice, passed to exclude specifically Chinese people. The same year, they decided that people could be banned from immigration for poor health, for lack of education, and if they were considered potential carriers of infectious disease, or if they were considered lunatics, meaning that they thought they had mental health issues. Now, keep in mind that every single one of those categories is subjective. There's no way to measure whose health is more poor than that of the typical American, whose education is more worthy than anybody else's. So 1882, we started passing laws to determine who is worthy and unworthy of coming to the U.S. 1891, we established by the federal government the first immigration services. Then again, in 1900 to 1920, we saw what was called the Great Wave of Immigrants. Nearly 24 million people migrated to the U.S., many of them from Europe, many of them from Asia, many of them from Latin American countries. In 1921, we passed the National Origins Quota System, which established a limit for how many immigrants could come over each year. And what it did was it limited it by nationality and by origin. But it was kind of fair in that it was, across the board. 1924, only 3 years later, we passed the Johnson-Reed quota system. They revised the quota system based on the U.S. Census, but it was the 1890 census from 34 years earlier. So in no way was it actually reflective of who was in the United States at that time. Then 1924 to 1945, there was almost no immigration because in the late 1920s, we had the Great Depression. Once the Great Depression hit and the Dust Bowl in the Midwest, there was no reason for anybody to want to come here. In fact, net immigration was less than zero during the Depression. As we're seeing now, we actually had more immigrants going back to their nations of origin during the Depression than coming here. Then in 1942, we passed Executive Order 9066. This was a shameful piece of policy in our nation's history because it was the policy that created the Japanese internment camps in 1942, which was kind of our version of concentration camps for Japanese folks. Now, it's important to note that this policy was not only for people who they called Japanese nationals, people who had immigrated here from Japan. It went on to also include first and second generation folks, people who had been born here up to 2 generations back from Japanese immigrants, were still considered to be enemies of the country. So they were put into these camps. They took over abandoned horse stables, old warehouses. People were allowed to carry only their body weight in their own belongings. They were forced to give up their homes, give up their cars, leave their jobs, leave almost everything of value. They sold houses for a couple $100s just to have something. Now, when we're saying you can carry your own body weight, let's just say you have a 50-pound child. Your 50-pound child cannot carry 50 pounds worth of stuff. So people were really limited to what they could fit in a couple bags that they could physically carry. And by the time the war was over and the internment camps had been emptied, many of them had died of disease. Many of them were told, we will strip away your enemy status if you join the armed forces and fight for us against Japan. Many of them died in the war trying to prove their loyalty to the United States. And by the time, again, this policy was repealed after World War II, our government had decimated much of the Japanese community. 1951 was the Bracero program, and that was when we went out of our way to bring people from Latin American countries, in particular Mexico, to come up north and farm for us because, they were good for that. 1952, the Immigration and Naturalization laws were recodified and combined into the Immigration and Nationality Act. 1965, Congress decided to replace their national origin quota system with what they called a preference system. They said it was meant to unite families and attract skilled immigrants. However, what they considered skills were skills from westernized folks. So it gave the advantage for immigration to European immigrants and took away much of the ability of immigrants from Asia, Latin America, and Africa to come over because we deemed the skills that they came to be undesirable skills. 1980, we passed the Refugee Act, which was how we decided what constituted a refugee versus an immigrant. 1986, Congress passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, the IRCA, which both called for amnesty for people who could be considered refugees and amnesty for people who had come here undocumented but were not considered to be troublemakers, but also for enforcement of people who did not voluntarily declare their status. 1990, the Immigration Act of 1990 significantly increased the total level of immigration to 700,000 people. The number of available visas, and a visa being what you need to come over legally and stay here, it increased it by 40%. They said that the goal was family reunification, but they also doubled employment-based immigration. They also realized that there were many underrepresented countries that we did not have people from that we knew of. They wanted to diversify immigrant flow, so they created a lottery system. So from 1990 to 1997, there was a U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform, and they said the credibility of immigration policy can be measured by a simple yardstick. The people who should get in do. The people who should not get in are kept out. And the people who we judge deportable are required to leave. So again, people who should get in will get in. The people who should not, we're going to keep out of here. And if you're already here and we don't want you here, we're going to deport you. Every bit of this was subjective. There was no actual empirical measure of what made somebody should get in or should not get in. It was purely up to the judgment of the officials who were making these decisions. 1996, under good old Bill Clinton, we had the Illegal Immigrant Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. Then 2001 came, September 11th. September 11th made the government rethink everything that had to do with immigration or any sort of travel. Previously, we hadn't, except for a little bit of time in the 80s during the Iran controversy, we hadn't really had a lot of time when we had a really strict scrutiny on people from the Middle East. However, because of September 11th, we decided that we needed to very strictly scrutinize anybody that we deemed to potentially be Arabic, in particular Muslim, because, they could all be terrorists. That's when we started the TSA, the people that when you go to the airport make you take your shoes off and get x-rayed. That's where the Patriot Act came from. That's where most of our anti-Muslim sentiment came from. 2005, the Real ID Act, which strengthened what was needed to prove citizenship. We had, in the same year, 2005, the Border Protection, Anti-Terrorism, and Illegal Immigration Control Act from the House. They wanted to pass that. They were laser focused on enforcement at the border. So that went to the House. 2006, there was a conflict in Congress over reform. The Senate, in response to the Border Protection, Anti-Terrorism Act, tried to pass the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act, the CIRA. So in May of 2006, the Senate passed that, but the House didn't like it. 2007, we had the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act. What they wanted to do at that time was they wanted to provide amnesty, meaning no prosecution, to the majority of undocumented immigrants, those who had not committed crimes, those who, lived a good and productive life, but were undocumented. They wanted to increase legal immigration, so make it easier for people to immigrate legally, but at the same time also increase enforcement of people who then came over undocumented. The public didn't like it because they said we want to make it harder, not easier, for people to come to our, golden magical nation. It did not pass a vote, and it was killed on the Congress floor and never spoken of again. 2013, we passed the Border Security, Economic Opportunity, and Immigration Modernization Act. That one passed the Senate, but was declined by the House. We've gone through many, many iterations of the Congress where the Senate and the House could not agree on anything, and nothing ever got accomplished. We're still kind of there now. 2014, under President Barack Obama, he signed 2 executive actions that delayed deportations for millions of undocumented immigrants. That was called DACA, Delayed Action for Children. So even at that time, even though people think Obama was incredibly progressive, even though he did sign DACA and he signed the DREAM Act, which were both great, there was an unprecedented number of undocumented immigrants who were deported by his administration. He, more than any other president in U.S. history, his administration deported more undocumented immigrants than any other administration in U.S. history. So when we consider the concepts of immigration and human rights, The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of a person, that everyone has the right everywhere to be recognized as a person before the law, that all are equal before the law and are entitled to equal protection, that nobody should be arrested to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile, that everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum for persecution, that no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of their nationality nor denied the right to change their nationality, and that everyone has the right to work, free choice of employment, just and favorable conditions of work, and protection against unemployment. Now, if you remember back to the social and economic justice class, we spoke about the fact that the United States is one of the only nations that never signed on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Again, for a reason. If we had signed on, we would have actually had to stand by all those things and grant people amnesty and let them come here and live a good life. And we don't feel like we're obligated to do that because we never signed on for that, right? Everyone without discrimination has the right to equal pay for equal work. They have the right to a fair and just compensation for the work they do, to obtain for themselves and their family an existence worthy of human dignity, supplemented if necessary by other means of social protection, and the right to rest and leisure and safe working conditions. We don't do that for people who are citizens. We sure don't do it for our undocumented immigrants. So wrapping up, what has happened since President Obama left office? Well, as you know, Trump came into office. Trump built his entire campaign on hate for Black and brown immigrants primarily, especially those in Latin American countries. But he had plenty to say about Asians. He had plenty to say about people from the Middle East. So since that time, there's been a strengthening of Border Patrol. There were ICE raids. We had the whole situation at the border with the children being stripped from their parents and put in detention centers. We had the issue of now sanctuary cities where undocumented immigrants will never be prosecuted for their status, and the retaliation from the Trump administration. We had family separations. We have the issue of refugees and amnesty. And while the Biden administration has certainly been better than the Trump administration, they've hardly reversed the damage that's been done, even though it could be done easily. So again, while in social work, we do tend to sadly stay to the more micro, part of our call, our ethical call, our moral calling, is to help all people regardless of their nationality or their status. And immigrants are human beings. They're very vulnerable human beings. And they are people to whom we owe our service and our vision of their dignity and worth. So I want you to look in the PowerPoint attached to this class. There is a YouTube video. I want you to watch it and be prepared to discuss it on Monday. I hope you all have a great week, and I will see you then. Bye.